Welcome back. I'm Max Bergman, director of the Stewart Center and Europe-Russia-Eurasia program at CSIS.
And I'm Maria Snegovaya, senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia.
And you're listening to Russian Roulette, a podcast discussing all things Russia and Eurasia from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Hello and welcome back to Russian Roulette. I'm Max Bergman, here with my co-host, as always, Maria Snegovaya. And today we're speaking with our colleagues Harley Balzer and Sergei Guriev to discuss their contributions to the recently released book, Failure, Russia Under Putin, which examines a wide range of failures Russia has experienced under Putin's leadership. Maria is also one of the volume's contributors and will be sharing her findings as well. So she's going to have to do double duty today as both a moderator and a panelist. But be sure to check out the link in this episode's show notes where you can purchase the volume. Please order a copy. It's excellent. And I think after the discussion that you're about to hear, I think everyone's going to run off and buy it. I should note that in addition to contributing to the volume, Harley also edited the work alongside Stephen A. Fisher. Let me just quickly introduce our guest. Harley is a professor emeritus of government and international affairs at Georgetown University and was the founding director of its Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, is a true legend in the field. And Sergei, welcome back to the podcast, is an internationally recognized economist who since August 2024 has served as the 10th Dean and tenured professor of economics at the London Business School. Well, Harley, welcome to the pod. Sergei, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you both here. So let me dive in. First, Harley, maybe I could start with you as one of the co-editors. You get to go first. I want to talk about your contribution, but maybe first, could you just maybe describe what prompted this edited volume about Putin's failures? Maybe just generally, why did you guys go about to solicit the contributions and what prompted it?
Well, Stephen Fisher was really the person who prompted it, who started it. And I think he was surprised at all the effort that he made with Citibank in Moscow that turned out to not produce a whole lot. I know some people made a lot of money, but Russia didn't seem to get a lot of economic improvement out of it. And the concept when we talked about it was Putin didn't fail at everything, but he failed at all the important things. And he failed especially at the things he most wanted to do, with a couple of exceptions. I mean, we didn't do a chapter on internal politics because it was pretty clear that Putin didn't want democracy. He didn't want civil society that had any independent activity. He didn't want serious opposition. He didn't want independent political institutions. He would never have wanted a Communist Party Central Committee that could vote him out of office. And he never wanted a clear successor, which is a normal thing for autocrats. And so that entire realm is kind of left to other people and other volumes, and there are several that can do it. He also succeeds in military campaigns based on bombing residential housing, starting with Chechnya and going on to Georgia and to Syria and now to Ukraine. Whether that's success in any real terms is another matter. And some might say that disseminating information and cyber warfare are also relative successes for Russia, although that's debatable. But we really wanted to focus on the things that he persistently claimed in his inaugural addresses as president, many of them repeated all 5 times, and that have either not succeeded at all or that he has undermined since then. And some of them have failed miserably. Others had some early success, but again, after 2012, it's gone down the tube. And I guess, he pronounced everybody talks about the economy being resilient. Sergei will talk about that. Stephen Fisher talks about the extent to which Putin wasted the FDI that was contributed to Russia by a lot of countries. The hydrocarbon wealth was used both for fulfilling the budget and also for his geostrategic efforts, and those require different strategies. So that has not worked terribly well. Agriculture was a relative success. Climate change and corruption and competition are undermining it now. Maria will talk about identity. Putin seems to have carried over a Russian exceptionalism that is kind of matched by Argentina or Serbia. Civil society has been curtailed. Its ability to help do the things Putin wanted to do is gone. I'll talk about demography, health education, science, technology in my chapter. Those are all disasters. He hasn't coped with diversity. Retrograde policies toward women and the gay community have been a way to sideline people who could be making contributions to the country. He has relied on the Siloviki, and that has really caused the same kinds of problems we saw after the Afghan war. As these people are coming back, they're becoming the new elite. And that is going to be a serious problem for a long time. Rule of law has been really replaced by rule by law. There's been a constant tightening of the rules, constant repression, and it's getting worse. The military reforms were much touted for a while. They didn't achieve their goals. The lessons that everybody thought he had learned in Syria and in Georgia have not resulted in military success of any great magnitude. And the foreign policy, which is probably my favorite chapter because of the great job Peter Clement has done, shows that rather than staving off NATO expansion, he's encouraged it, and Russia has been losing its allies and now has to work only with countries that are interested in essentially transactional behavior rather than mutual benefit. And there's some things we didn't cover in the book: religion, youth, regional and class wealth inequalities. And the biggest one is probably environment and climate change. And that's particularly dangerous at a time when the United States is giving up on climate change issues. The result of that may be to make China great.
So, Harley, maybe we could turn to the chapter that you authored on Russian human capital decline or demise. What were the key sort of takeaways from that chapter and from your study of that?
Well, Putin has talked about the demographic problem over and over again, and they have not made progress. Currently, the program to 2035 is to get back to where they were in 2016 in terms of fertility rates. His policy toward migrants has been a disaster. They are way up there with countries that want to deport them. The worst part of it has been impressing people into military service who thought they were coming to Russia to work. They've rounded up Central Asians in large numbers and shipped them to the front, sometimes with no equipment and not even with boots. And it's also, that's spilled over into foreign policy. They have enticed workers from India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh to come to Russia supposedly to work, and they've confiscated their passports and shipped them to the front, which is undermining the relationship, especially with India now. The health system is a disaster. It's getting worse. The latest one is an outbreak of some really serious infections that do not seem to be responding to treatment. Russia had the highest per capita mortality rate from COVID of any country in the world. Their science system has been seriously undermined, and the biggest disaster has been technology, where they have wasted maybe 5 trillion rubles by now and not recovered from what they went through after starting in really 2003, when Kasyanov and Putin decided to, like Brezhnev, in hydrocarbon development and use the money to buy everything else they needed. And what they have to import now has gone through the roof. And their entire import substitution has been a total failure. Russian sources have really demonstrated that. And I can come back to that later on if you want.
Thank you very much, Harley. Sergei, let's turn to you for now. You have a great chapter in the volume entitled The Failure of Putinomics, which discusses Putin's preferred political economic model. Would you mind walking our listeners through the key characteristics of that model, the main features and goals, and how do we see Putin taking action to achieve those intended goals? Of course, as you know, the issues of Russian economic resilience have been quite widely debated, and from that perspective, your position would be really interested, and especially what's changed in your assessment since you submitted the article.
All right, thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much, Max, for inviting me to this podcast. Indeed, the chapter focuses on the overall 25 years account of Putin's economic policy, and by this time, we probably see what preferred political economic model is for Putin. And economic policy for Putin is a tool to stay in control. So in principle, he's not against good economic policy. He's not against competition. He's not against meritocracy, as long as that doesn't threaten his control, his probability of survival, standing in power. And that means that, yes, he wants to avoid macroeconomic turbulence and meltdowns, and this is why he is actually quite supportive of macroeconomic policy, which maintains macroeconomic stability. He's done a great job delegating monetary and fiscal policy to competent technocrats, despite certain periods of instability, especially around global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and 2014. Period of sanctions after annexation of Crimea and decline in oil prices, overall economy has fared reasonably well. Initially, economy did very well. Actually, this is something that people attribute to Putinomics, saying that, look, Putin has done a great job growing the economy in the first 10 years. And I talk about this. I'm saying that Putin's been lucky, benefiting from growth in oil prices in the first 10 years in power. He's also inherited reforms, and some of those reforms continued in his first years in power. At that point, he thought he needs economic growth to gain legitimacy. But he also saw that with oil prices going up, he can actually stay in power through distributing the spoils of this economic growth by expanding the control of the state and by the state of the Russian economy. Also, he used internal political tools and selective targeted repression to subvert democratic institutions, judiciary institutions, co-opt or censor media, initially selectively and then increasingly so, also co-opting or selectively repressing oligarchs. So basically, for him, Putinomics is a tool to be in charge of the economy, even though eventually this model, of course, destroyed economic growth. The first 10 years where Putin rode the luck of growing oil prices was actually the best 10 years in Russian economic history. But then the growth disappeared. Why? Because this model of crony capitalism, expansion of the state, eventually undermined the spirit of entrepreneurship and investment in human capital that Harley was talking about. And the reason for that is very clear. As I said, Putin is not against market economy as long as there is no threat for him politically. And of course, if you allow independent economic actors, that creates independent political actors. And in Russia, like in other countries, authoritarian leaders usually don't like that. And so Putinomics combines this macroeconomic stability with stagnation, with overall ambivalent attitude to economic policy, as long as economic policy and institutional change doesn't undermine his hold on power, he's fine with that. Now, as I said, this model eventually destroyed economic growth. So after 2008, 2009, growth slowed down to very low rates, eventually pretty much to zero. Income stopped to grow. And popularity also started to fall. So Putin decided that a quick small victorious war would actually be helpful to restore popularity, and that worked very well. But then the effect of this war faded away again, and Putinomics could not produce new sources of growth. So he tried to start a new war again, trying to rekindle his popularity, which we don't know whether it worked or not. We don't know. Since I've submitted this chapter, and the first draft was prepared more or less in 2022, I would not really walk away from the conclusions. I think the history of 25 years of Putinomics is what it is. I did not predict collapse of Putin's economy. Actually, I said, despite unprecedented sanctions and substantial increase in military spending, Putin's economy is not likely to collapse anytime soon. And the reason for that is exactly because Putin invests in macroeconomic stability even today. There is also another issue. As I said, Putin uses selective repression, but after 2022, the scale of repression has increased substantially. So whoever's unhappy no longer has any opportunities for expressing this discontent. So Putinomics failing economically also drives Russia into a much more repressive state politically. But overall, I won't really change this chapter much since I started to write it in 2022 and submitted it a couple of years ago.
Maria, let's get some more details on your chapter in the book titled Who Are We? Russia's Post-Soviet Identity Building Failure. What prompted you to write on this topic? And maybe you could talk about what are your main takeaways on post-Soviet identity formation?
Yeah, thank you, Max, for that question. As you know, my first book deals with the economic origins of illiberalism in post-communist Europe. However, somebody who comes from Russia, I also couldn't help but notice that the origin of Putin's ability to hold on to power have more than economic tools to it, even if, of course, I agree with Sergei and the way he described the resilience of Putinism. Specifically, the Soviet Union, for all its failures, did instill in its citizens a powerful collective identity, which was rooted in exceptionalism status, this global superpower status. And the Soviet Union basically competed against the United States on par with the United States, ruled the world. And with the Soviet Union gone, basically that created a sort of void in the minds of many Russian citizens. Many of us who lived for the 1990s may remember people lamenting, what great country did we lose? And Putin basically, as I argue, sensed that and basically was able to provide, substitute, fill in that void with an identity that he built, drawing very heavily from the Soviet legacy. I do talk about the efforts to construct alternative identities, some sort of vision for the country's future during Yeltsin's period. And the most iconic, sort of ironic example of it is the Российская газета, the nationwide publication, actually announcing a competition in 1996, offering an equivalent of $2,000 to any caller who could come up with a unifying national idea for the for Russia. And perhaps the most ironic ending, it was the ending of the story, that the contest produced no winners, in a very telling sort of outcome, unfortunately predicting what were to happen next. I also will remind our audiences that the Russian society was heavily divided on the Soviet past in the 90s, and that's one of the reasons, for example, why Yeltsin did not take steps to evict Lenin's body from the mausoleum. It is still very much there. That was because the public opinion polls indicated a split on whether Lenin should be buried or not. And by the way, quick reference to today, just recently an announcement that mausoleum was going to be closed for construction created huge lines of people on the Red Square rushing to actually visit Lenin's body. This was just this year, just to demonstrate how basically alive these ideas are still in the Russian citizens. And so Putin, as I argue, sensed this void and very aptly filled in with this idea of a great, basically resurgent Russia. Many analysts argue that Putin has no basically national idea, but together with Jade McGlynn and our various publications, we actually have shown, I think convincingly, that it actually is there. It's the vision of the future that's going to look more like the past, with resurgent great Russia again competing with the West, against the West, and very much reproducing the key achievement of the Soviet era, the victory in the Second World War, which became the major nationwide holiday in Russia. Now, unfortunately, indeed resurrecting is this horrible war in Ukraine that the Kremlin is fighting. Just a reminder again that while much of the European countries commemorates the victory in the Second World War with the motto, never again, Russian motto has always been, under Putin, we can do it again. And unfortunately, under Putin, they ended up doing it again. One thing they did not realize, though, that this time, I'm afraid they are the Nazi in this story.
Harley, maybe let me turn back to you. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the demography issues, and also how kind of sanctions and other challenges to Russia from a technology perspective have impacted Russia. You know, is Russia sort of today feeling the effects of many years of economic sanctions, both since its full-scale invasion, but also since 2014? Is that impacting Russia's sort of human capital and how Russian society operates?
It has unquestionably had an impact, and it has been growing over time. I mean, the one place where Sergei and I might differ a little bit is my sense in the economy is that the things that his economic specialists have been doing have been heroic, but they also are altering the basic nature of the economy. And how much you can jiggle those policies and still have a normal functioning economy is, to me, the biggest question for the next 2 or 3 years. You know, Matvienko got up in the Duma and said they're in real trouble. So did a lot of people at the Petersburg Forum, and I'm thinking that Putin looks like King Canute saying, I won't let it happen. He may be lucky that these folks will keep putting it off. But back to the technology, back to the demography, technology, other areas, the human capital story is a really depressing disaster. And for some of us who spent 25 years trying to help Russia build up their capabilities in these areas, it has been sad to watch. But the sanctions have had a pretty major impact. We should have seen this coming. Back in 1993-94, the economics counselor in St. Petersburg, Andrew Goodman, was hanging out with Putin a lot. They're talking about foreign investment, development, and Putin was talking about the need to restore the Soviet Union's empire. That's way before NATO expansion was even on the table. And it's been pretty much downhill since then. I would say, there are 7 deadly sins in human capital. All 3 of the ways you improve your demographic performance have been undermined. The natural increase, birth rates, fertility rate, it improved slightly for a few years. There's a big debate among the Russian specialists whether that was due to the number of women in the childbearing cohort or to the maternity capital program. Either way, it stopped by 2015. Official statistics on this are a joke. And now the program to 2035 is to get back to where they were in 2015. But they can't do it because the cohort of women in major childbearing cohorts right now is going to be really low for at least a decade and probably forever. The worst prognosis from the UN is that by 2100, population of Russia will be cut in half. Putin's policies have really discouraged immigration. The health program has resulted in no improvement of any serious magnitude in life expectancy. COVID was a disaster. The war has created 1 million casualties. People argue whether it's 100,000 or 200,000 have been killed, but the number who are disabled is growing, and the programs to help them are severely underfunded. There doesn't seem to be any good way to increase the Russian population. Education system has gone down both in terms of the number of students, the level of attainment, and the quality. And the latest programs for higher education really seem to focus on a new elite made up of the war veterans. I'm still waiting for somebody to explain to me whether that includes the criminals released from prison by Prigozhin, who could now be part of the new elite. But preference in admission to higher education is going to be based in part on your record of service in the, quote, special military operation. There are already, I think, 3 or 4 governors who were picked from the returning soldiers, and they just listed a few more who are going into the Federation Council next year. The science has been a serious decline. Number of publications, number of withdrawn publications, number of students. I can come back to some of that data. And the technology is the major disaster. My next book, I think, is going to be called Technocide, How Vladimir Putin Stole Russia's Future. If you look at the World International Property Organization data, China outperforms and Russia severely underperforms. That is, the amount Russia invests compared to what it gets back is pathetic. And the human capital data is actually mutually reinforcing with foreign policy. The decision to bring workers from India, Bangladesh, several other countries, including Central Asia, have really set back their relationship with those countries diplomatically. The worst one is probably India. Modi is furious about this. Now, I think that, we've had pretty good coverage of the demography, the health, the education, and even some of the science data in the Soviet Union. We haven't had much coverage of the technology data. And in 2013, when he was planning to annex Crimea, Putin started talking about import substitution. They've put between 3 and 5 trillion rubles into this, and there are a few small successes, but for the most part, they are pretty much where they were more than a decade ago. In 2018, he switched from import substitution to leasing and localization, trying to get foreign countries to build factories. That didn't work. They estimated that they could replace 90% of the textile machinery and 85% of cement mixers for numerically controlled machine tools, which are crucial to building anything. They thought they could get 7%, and for the laser and ultrasound cutters, they thought they could get 1%. And that's pretty much where they are. We went back to technical sovereignty. Now the new idea is leadership, but the data indicates it's getting worse rather than better. End of 2022, a study claimed that despite all of the 1,500 projects and 3 or 4 trillion rubles, dependence on foreign technology had increased significantly between 2018 and 2022, and that table's in the book.
Sergei,
I'm sorry, China has helped, but it's really had costs, and I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you, Harley. Sergei, maybe let me bring you back in. I think Harley's painting a very dismal state of where Russia is headed. So this begs the question, then, where do you see the kind of Russian economy presently? Is this on the verge of failure and collapse? One thing sort of not mentioned is that there has been a big transfer of wealth, I think, from a lot of the more prosperous cities and regions to the hinterland, where especially, money going to people that are signing up to fight, those that have been lost on the front. There's money pouring into regions that have been neglected. So is there kind of a counterbalancing here where things are dismal, but yet Russia can sort of continue on? How do you see, the really dire picture Harley is painting? Is that going to lead to that's failure, but is failure going to lead to sort of a broader collapse, I guess is the question.
Thank you, Max. And indeed, the question is the definition of terms. This is what Socrates once said. This beginning of wisdom is definition of terms. When we say failure, we mean that Russia missed the opportunity. What Harley correctly said, for example, Russia missed an opportunity to be a technological leader, to build knowledge-intensive economy. But it doesn't mean that Russia is falling apart. Collapse may mean many things, but what we are now talking about, and when Harley said that we slightly differ, I think we both agree that Russian economy is probably right now on the verge of recession, but recession is not collapse. What I'm talking about is stagnation, and again, Russian economic performance in recent years was exactly as you said. Russia has developed a dual economy where you have people who benefit from the war, including, as you rightly said, some very poor and neglected regions where soldiers are recruited and their families are getting amounts of money they've never seen before. And then you have the civilian economy, which is facing growing prices and incomes which not catch up with the growing prices. And so this military versus civilian economy dualism is very visible. And when we say recession, that means that the military economy is stagnating or not growing while the civilian economy is in recession. We say stagnation, we mean that military economy is growing a bit and the civilian economy is stagnating substantially or not that much. But what I'm saying is I don't see collapse in terms of suddenly we go back to a macroeconomic meltdown like 1998 or the one in 1991 when Soviet Union disintegrated. Putin, when we talk about the failure, Putin has failed Russia. But Putin is very much in control still. And despite all his disadvantages, all his problems with getting adequate feedback, reliable information from his lieutenants and from the battlefield, he still is a rocket scientist in staying in power. He survived for 25 years. He used co-optation, targeted censorship, targeted repression, international relations, various connections inside and outside of Russia to stay in power. He threatened some people, he co-opted others. And right now what's happening is, as you rightly said, the pie is shrinking. So to keep people around him loyal, he has to expropriate some people who are slightly further away. These people are unhappy, but with increasing amount of fear and repression, Putin keeps everybody in check so far. Sometimes we see those things like the Prigozhin's affair. Sometimes we see that a minister commits suicide or suicide in quotes. We don't know what's actually happened. But overall, even though everybody's unhappy, everybody also understands that it's physically dangerous to stand up against Putin, and increasingly so. So he's this chess master which plays on several boards, and so far he's been successful staying in power, which is his ultimate goal. That said, Putinomics has failed to raise incomes of Russians, especially compared to counterfactual. Harley's mentioned China. there are other counterfactuals in the world. Russia has failed and missed the opportunity, but Putin is still in his office and he's very satisfied with that.
Maybe I will jump in by asking our participants the broader question, criticism that came out from some of the colleagues who have read the volume. And the main criticism is about whether what we're seeing is really a failure for the regime. Perhaps it's a failure from an outside perspective only, but for the Siloviki who are on top of the Russian politics and controlling the regime, maybe they are indeed achieving their goals. So how would you address that particular question? Harley, let maybe start with you.
Sure. The Siloviki are probably happy. The defense industry has become what I call the Willie Sutton economy. The level of corruption is ginormous. In 2018, they showed him a piece of machinery that was an example of great Russian import substitution. It was bought from Moscow Oblast. It was on TV. Everybody who saw it, immediately the engineers called and said, wait a minute, that's Italian equipment. It was bought by a company in Moscow Oblast. They repainted it and sold it for more than double the price to the guys in Kazan. The biggest one is probably his favorite hyper weapon, the Sarmat missile that he showed off in March 2018. After he showed it off, there was no flight test. This went on for a couple of years. They finally tested it in 2022. The reason for the delay was that they handed over 3 billion rubles for the flight test, and a third of it disappeared within 24 hours. 2 more flight tests failed. They tried one more and it blew up the launch pad. So Russia no longer has a reliable, heavy intercontinental ballistic missile. That's failure. And if the Siloviki are happy with it, it's because they're making money off it. It's not because it is helping the country. And if they keep pouring money down this military rat hole where it gets stolen, they're going to be in big trouble.
Sergei.
Yeah, I think I agree with Harley. There are beneficiaries of the war, but a lot of unhappy people are also right there, including in KGB, including in the army. There are people, as we know, that really enjoyed their opportunities buying real estate in France, UK, and vacationing outside of Russia. And when you occasionally see the interviews of people who do talk to foreign journalists, nobody's happy. So in that sense, yes, there is much more fear. And we should not trust people who are saying, look, Moscow is doing very well, everybody's happy, everybody's smiling. People who are not smiling are no longer in Moscow. They're further east or further west. So this is a very different, and it's very hard to compare to what used to be the case before 2022. Expressing discontent publicly is dangerous. We are recording this podcast on July 17th. Yesterday, Duma proposed a wonderful idea that even if you just search for illegal content on Russian internet, that's already enough to issue a penalty or maybe again start a criminal investigation against you. So in a sense, the amount of discontent we observe now is minimal, not because there is no discontent, but because this is very dangerous to express this discontent. But pre-2020, the Russian elite was extremely excited about the opportunities to have their assets outside of Russia, to vacation outside of Russia, to own real estate outside of Russia. And that was a real preference. They didn't store their money in China or Venezuela, right? So they thought that there is a reason to have a Swiss bank account and not a Venezuelan bank account. And they didn't buy real estate in North Korea. I'm not sure there is how active and liquid North Korean real estate market is. So they did appreciate this opportunity. And the fact that they are not publicly expressing regret about not being able to do that anymore doesn't mean that they don't have those regrets. Of course they do.
Maybe I will also jump in by answering my own question. Thank you very much, Sergei and Harley. I would actually refer to the popular Soviet tale entitled The Tale of Lost Time, which, according to the plot, and many kids read it during their high school years in the Soviet Union, elderly men steal youth from young boys temporarily, but as you can imagine, this doesn't end well to anyone. I kind of can't help but notice that Russia really is going through that exact tale as we speak. Plus, again, while we do see, of course, many people in Russia today putting on a good face in a bad game, just as Sergei has described, reminded that at the start of the war, it was pretty obvious to everyone that Putin has miscalculated very badly. And the reason why he miscalculated was precisely all these inherent vices and problems to his system. FSB unable to provide correct information, many of the elite members unable to adjust the priors, that only with a lot of effort and huge sacrifice of very quiescent Russian society were they able to basically somewhat reset and put country on the more or less manageable pathway after the original catastrophic abysmal first months of the 2022 war. But last but not the least, I would add that my chapter is somewhat different from the rest of the contributors, in where I actually describe the origins of the failure, not just being Putin himself, but also the Russian society, the Russian elites, unable to shrug off this painful Soviet legacy, unable to reckon with the crimes of the past. And these basically blinders, this unwillingness reckon with the past actually led them into arguably potentially even worse future. So where I come from, I definitely do not only put all the blame on Putin. I do believe that the Russian society does care a degree of responsibility for what happened to it, for the failure of its futures.
Maybe one final question for all three of you. I guess, do we consistently overestimate Putin's vulnerability? This book, I think, really persuasively lays out all the cases of failure, of not seizing opportunities. Harley outlined the demographic challenges, loss of human capital. I'm looking at both Sergei and Maria, not in Russia, and that's an example of a loss of Russian human capital. But then do we overestimate Putin's vulnerability? For years, the Russian opposition has predicted Putin's downfall, feels like for going on 2 decades, but yet he remains in power. His grip on power seems incredibly firm. And so are we missing sources of resilience in the Putin regime? Sergei, maybe we'll start with you, then go Harley and Maria to close this out.
Thank you, Max. Indeed, sometimes people just resort to wishful thinking just to convince themselves that things are not that bad and our fight will bring this regime down. Putin has shown incredible resilience, yes, at the cost of stealing Russia's future. Maria mentioned this tale of the lost time, which I won't call a Soviet fairy tale. I would call it anti-Soviet fairy tale. It was written by a great Soviet dissident writer, Evgeny Schwartz. So Russia lost an opportunity, and this is the price Russia's paid for Putin's very cunning policies and politics, which keep him in place still. And this is how those regimes survive. Some of those regimes are more capable of survival than others, and Putin has shown he's quite capable. He outlasted some of his peers and clients. But if you think about this, even such an incompetent regime as Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela, which has seen an economic collapse not comparable to what's happened in Russia, and that Russia will never repeat. Venezuela lost 3/4 of its GDP, 20% of population. This is a humanitarian crisis, and yet he remains in power through sheer force and repression. Relative to that, Putin is actually doing reasonably well in economic terms. We've also seen regimes that have gone through decades of repression and famine and still being able to survive through mass repression and fear. So, of course, what Maria was talking about, ideology helps. If you have a consistent ideology, that would help. So far, we don't see that a lot of Russians are excited about this. So Putin has to pay soldiers. Nobody volunteers to go to that war for free. But overall, Putin has done a great job. He's a survivor. He's a very skillful manipulator. He creates those myth narratives, and economy is just sufficient to recruit enough soldiers and produce enough drones. So this is where we are, and Putin chooses his opponents very carefully. He doesn't go to war with Turkey, for example. When Turkey supported Azerbaijan in Azeri-Armenian war, Putin did not do anything to protect his allies in Armenia. He didn't stand up to Syrian opposition when his ally Assad was deposed, right? So when he understands that it's not easy for him to win a war, he doesn't start the war. So this is where, and this is what I'm mentioning, and this is what other chapters are mentioning. 2022 was actually a mistake. He thought I guess, that this war would be similar to 2014. And maybe he had a chance to conquer Kiev. What we know about Gostomel battle in the beginning of the war, he was on the verge of taking this airfield next to Kiev, and who knows what would have happened. But still, he did not manage to achieve a quick victory, and that is going to cost him in terms of yes, he will probably stay in power for a while, but that is still a shorter expected life expectancy, regime life expectancy, than would be otherwise. But he still is in power, and people who said that his days are numbered are apparently have been mistaken.
Harley, what are your thoughts?
To me, the two really interesting issues here are, one, what has he done to Russian society? And a lot of it looks like what happened when the Afghans came back, when Russia pulled out of the war in Afghanistan. There's been a lot of that with the soldiers who have come back, especially the ones Prigozhin recruited, who have reverted to their previous behavior. The society is becoming a lot rougher. My worst example of it is the women who have now become serial wives of older men who then go to the front. And the worst version of this I heard from someone was that in some cases, if the Ukrainians don't get them fast enough, they hire the mafia to do it and split the war benefits with them. Now, there are people who I think are fed up with this kind of world. A lot of them have left, but not all of them. And the one thing that gives me hope for Russia is that if you look back on the leadership changes since the middle of the 18th century, there is not a single case except for Chernenko where the new leader did not change a significant part of either the foreign or domestic policy or both of their predecessor. And the real hope for me is not that somebody gets Putin out of there, because you'd have no idea who it would be and how they would do it and what it would result in, but that whoever comes next may realize the pit he's dropped the country into and try to do something about it.
Thank you very much, Sergei. And Harley, I will just conclude by saying that I think from analytical perspective, yes, we do tend to overpredict the collapse of the regime. I think that's true. And there are some analytical issues that we should be factoring in. Having said that, it's also kind of consistent with historical analysis where Russia is never as strong as she looks, nor as weak as she looks. We know that. Plus, the reason why the war so far has not been as detrimental for Russia, for Putin, as originally expected, is actually precisely the fact that this war is fought in a very traditionalist, maybe outdated manner, at enormous social cost and sacrifice that Russian society, for some reason, allows Putin. But this war would not have been possible if Russia was a little bit more modernized. So ironically, somewhat, this was actually the situation where the lack of modernization helped Putin somewhat. But as Harley and Sergei flagged, this is not just the war that's happening at the expense of Russia's future. It's possibly happening at a far larger scale, because following the end of the Soviet Union, Russia was really given a chance by the Western liberal community, somewhat a premature chance, the chance that it didn't really deserve by, for example, joining the G7+1 before it fit all of the criteria. Frankly, it sacrificed all of this advances for the reasons that I in particular described in my chapter, for the reasons of trying to restore its past imperial glory. It is very unlikely that Russia will get this chance again following this experience. Lastly, I will add that while it did take the Soviet Union 70 years to collapse, the time passes more quickly now. And as Master Margarita's novel says, the problem is not just that humans are mortal, but that they're suddenly mortal, right? The suddenness of the collapse may also come faster than we anticipated, especially if failure to modernize finally catches up with this regime. And after the energy transition, Russia will lose its main advantage, basically the energy, being able to produce energy.
I think that's a great place to leave it. I actually take some real optimism, especially from Harley's comments about there's, I think, a stereotype or a presumption of whoever comes next after Putin might be worse, and totally might be. On the other hand, I think what the book outlines is, here's all the ways Russia is failing. And if I was a new leader coming in, I would say maybe we try not to fail so much, and that there's different paths that could be taken, and oftentimes going in different directions. I take that as somewhat of a hopeful way to maybe to end this podcast. I want to thank you, Harley and Sergei, for joining us. The book is fantastic. It is called Failure: Russia Under Putin. Please order a copy. It's out now from Bloomsbury Publishing. We've got a link in our show notes. So please check that out. And as always, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to our show and give us a 5-star rating. Additionally, if you get the chance, be sure to check out our sister podcast, The Europhile, wherever you get your podcasts. And we look forward to continuing the conversation next time on Russian Roulette.
You've been listening to Russian Roulette. We hope you enjoyed this episode and tune in again soon.
Russian Roulette releases new episodes every 2 weeks on Thursdays and is available wherever you get your podcasts. So please subscribe and share our episodes online.
And be sure to check out all the latest analysis by the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at csis.org.